So, as I mentioned before, fear is a big word. It gives us pause, sometimes even stops us in our tracks. Occasionally, when we're driving around, we stumble into something that I think causes a lot of people fear. How many of you are afraid of driving across tall bridges or bridges that are just above the water? No? I was going to say, you better put your hand up on that one. Because it does. It affects Stephanie very deeply. And it's not necessarily just a high bridge. One of the ones that's in the area that I can think of is the Tacony-Palmyra Bridge. Is that right? Maybe not. It's the one in New York that runs right across the lake. The Verrazano Bridge. Tappan Zee Bridge, that's it. I knew it was there somewhere. But it sits right on the water. And Steph, every time we drive across that, sits in her seat, quietly closes her eyes and says, "Let me know when we're done." But it's a fear that she has. Some people are so afraid of bridges that it causes them to stop in the middle. How many of you have ever seen anybody stopped in the middle of a bridge? No? There are actually bridges. You have, Jocelyn? Okay. There are actually bridges in the California region where they have people specially assigned that if you are afraid to drive across a tall bridge, they will get in your car, drive it across for you, and then you can continue on your way. It's because of these operators that get so frightful that it causes like major traffic jams. In 1991, Michigan's Timid Motorist Program assisted 830 drivers across the Mackinac Bridge. Now that bridge is 5 miles long and rises 200 feet above the water. At Maryland's Chesapeake Bay Bridge, how many of you have driven across that one? That's a really big bridge, right? It's over 4 miles long, raises 200 feet above the water. Authorities took the wheel and helped over 1,000 motorists in their program. But these aren't the only things that cause us fear, right? They're just some of the most obvious ones. When we get into these terrifying situations, sometimes it causes us to stop entirely and to freeze in our spot. So as we begin the Advent season this year, we're going to journey with our fears. Now, bear in mind that as we explore these biblical passages throughout Christmas and begin to translate them for our lives, the goal is not to amplify our fears, but to rather dismantle and disrupt those fears a little bit for us, to give us hope about what is coming into the world as we move closer to Christmas, to help us to have a more compassionate relationship with our fear, using it as a tool for deeper faith, for bolder courage and resilient hope. And so I'll have some pictures that you'll get a chance to look at as we explore together. But today we look at one of those stories, one that's not often explored at this time of year, if it's ever studied. It's one that I believe needs our attention because, especially in this day and time, we find some very strong similarities between the story and our lives. And what we have before us is not necessarily directly related to Jesus' story, but it's an important part. This is the birth announcement or the annunciation of John the Baptist's birth, who is Jesus' cousin. John is important to his story because he is the forerunner, right? He is the person that goes out in the wilderness and prepares the way for Jesus to come into the world, for Jesus to begin his ministry. And John, as we hear throughout Jesus' story, is the one who does not necessarily fit the idea of a prophet, right? I mean, he's not one that people look at very strongly for that reason. But he truly is a prophet of Christ and what he came to do. Now, before I get too far away from our story, let's talk for a few minutes about this birth announcement. So what we have, and here's what we know. Luke, the only gospel that tells this story, invites us into the life of two very important people, a priest named Zechariah and his wife Elizabeth. Now, Zechariah is a priest in the division of Abijah, which means that he is descended from a long line of priests that started with Aaron. And if we're familiar with those stories, Aaron is Moses' brother, and he does all of the talking for Moses. and he's also Israel's first priest. Zechariah's wife Elizabeth is also descended from this line, but from a different family. Now, what's really important to know about these two individuals is that they are beyond middle age. How many of us would like to be told that we're going to have a child? I'm not seeing any hands. I'm glad to know that, unless we're in our 20s or 30s. Melissa's shaking her head no. But here's Elizabeth. She's beyond the age of being able to conceive. And she is being told by her husband, oh, by the way, we're going to have a child. And she goes, I don't think so. But this is what they're being told. And it's important because for them in this time, as a priest and in the lineage of Aaron, they were expected to be able to carry on that line. They were expected to have children, to be able to have further priests in that line. And Luke tells us that by being barren, like her ancestor Sarah, Elizabeth is actually shamed. He references this but doesn't specifically say it. But she is shamed, as is Zechariah, for not being able to produce a child. And at that time, people looked at it as a punishment from God for not being able to have children. And this simple fact would have been seen as an indication of their sinful nature of Zechariah and Elizabeth. And what I mean is that if you could not conceive, again, it's a punishment for God from the sins that you have done. Now, imagine that. I don't have a hard time with this one, so just bear with me. But imagine being a priest and being told that you're sinful. Think about that for a minute. Here is a man who represents the temple and all that is holy in this world. And he's being told that he is too sinful because he has no children. Now, I'm glad that we don't necessarily see it that way today. But at that time, Luke makes a very distinct point in telling us that neither of these two individuals, neither Zechariah nor Elizabeth, had a reason to think that they were not righteous in the sight of God because they were faithful in worshiping God and keeping the commandments. Luke tells us that. And like many other Old Testament birth stories, this story, this account, evokes the theme of barrenness to highlight that God is present with Zechariah and Elizabeth. God's reversal for this one family signifies that God is present to save and deliver the people who follow and believe. You see, in my mind, the grace that Zechariah and Elizabeth received follows the pattern of God's intervention in all of those other stories that we hear about women who were unable to conceive, but also that the one who is to come as a result is very special. The other highlight about these two parents, especially Zechariah, as a priest, he would have had the privilege of being able to burn incense in the temple one time in his entire life. Let me say that again. Once would he have been given the opportunity to do this. And by chance, he has this opportunity in this story. Again, to give us an indication about how important and special John's birth is going to be. You see, apart from all of the major pilgrim festivals that occur, each of the priestly divisions served in the temple for just 2 weeks a year. And because of the large number of priests in each division, each individual priest would have only been given this opportunity once. So Luke's point on this is that this is an important occasion for Zechariah, and God chooses this moment to appear to him through an angel. And as all the other stories that we hear, what are we told that Zechariah is when he sees the angel? He is afraid. The moment he sees the angel, he is struck by fear, and rightfully so. I mean, if an angel appeared here this morning before us, who amongst us would be like, ooh, look, an angel? You would? Okay, good. I'd probably be going, do I run and hide or do I stand and face, right? I mean, this is something that's not typical. But there's Zechariah in this holy place, lifting. Now imagine the scene. He's in this holy place. There's nobody else around him. He's the only one in this room. He is lifting prayers, lighting incense to acknowledge the prayers of all those people who are gathered outside. It is dead silent. And all of a sudden, somebody says to him, Zechariah! Right? I mean, he had to be startled. He's not anticipating anybody to be with him. And if you've ever walked up on me in my office when I'm focusing on my sermon, you know that's how I respond. And suddenly someone spoke to him. Now, I might actually need to change my clothes, just saying. Despite commentary from the front row here. Despite this, the angel had a very important message to deliver. But before the angel utters that message, the first thing the angel says is, do not be afraid. And these are words we hear quite often in Scripture. In fact, it's in over 300 different verses within the Bible. And I will say that not being afraid might be the furthest thing from my mind. Yet, when you are afraid, are you able to focus on anything other than your fear in that moment? No. Right? I mean, your mind is just so focused on what it is that you're afraid of. And the angel's really important message that comes to Zechariah in that moment is that he and Elizabeth will finally receive the ultimate blessing of a child, which also means that God has finally answered all of their prayers. Now, that's not the end of our story for today either, because I think that now that we understand the importance of the message that they receive, we also need to understand that the world into which John and Jesus were born created and had some real fears. And I want us to imagine that world for a moment. There's a powerful ruler on the throne of Rome, and he has ruled with might and with strength. He has also assigned someone to rule over Judea named Herod. And this is a world filled with violence, occupation, and fear. Can we relate? It's not unlike our own time, and yet this is the time that God chooses to send John and ultimately Jesus into the world. I mean, think about it. This was no golden age of peace or spiritual clarity. There was none of that happening. It was a time of survival under the empire of Rome. Herod governed in a way that created paranoia, and he was very cruel. He, in fact, took his power and killed several of his sons and murdered his wife out of fear and paranoia. Don't get me wrong, he did some really great things, but for that time, he was absolutely the cruelest thing in the world. This was a time where people worried about being able to provide for their families. It was a time that the governor ruled with an iron fist. Herod suffered in mental illness and often saw visual hallucinations. He executed his wife, her family, and several of his sons. He orchestrated the killing of a multitude of infants and toddlers because of his fear of somebody overtaking his throne. He was ruthless, he was insecure, and it's no wonder that people were living in fear. Here's the thing, though. Despite all this, God was so bold as to send two men into the world to first prepare it for the coming of the second, and that would be the Messiah. And then for that Messiah to come in and resist this tyranny by reaching out to those on the fringe of society. Not the rulers and the elite, but the fringe of society. Those in need. Those who did not, by society's standards, fit the norm of the time. To provide hope for the real fear that existed. Can you imagine that? Hope for tomorrow, despite our fears? Can you imagine that? This is what Jesus does. In that time, Zechariah and Elizabeth had hoped for a child for many years. They had prayed for one, and it was not that they had not prayed or hoped hard enough. It was just not the right time for John to be in the world. And then one day when it was, they were told they would be parents, their dreams would come true. And they were also told that John would bring them and the world much joy and pride. They waited, and when it was right, their prayers were answered. And so as we begin this Advent season together of waiting and praying, I want for us to take some time to sit with our fears. To know that just because God hasn't answered the prayers that we may have prayed at this point, doesn't mean it's a no. Just may mean not right now. Not to wallow in our fears, but rather to look them right in the eye and remind that fear that we are not controlled by it, but rather allow God to break into our lives, interrupt those fears, and be able to turn them into hope. Amen.